So tell us, we always like to know a little bit about our speaker. Please tell us, why is this, how did you get in it, and what does it mean? And also tell us a little bit about neurodivergency.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me start with sharing a little bit about myself. I started my journey with neurodiversity all the way in 2011. And I started a part-time job as a therapist, and I was assigned a student who was an 8-year-old Ethiopian boy. And he was the most beautiful boy I had ever seen. He was completely nonverbal, though, so he was not speaking, which is something that happens to people who have autism. And at the time, I thought I wanted to pursue a PhD in social psychology. And the day that I received the acceptance letter to the school that I wanted to go to, that little child spoke his first words. And there was nothing else that I could ever imagine in my life that I would want to do than to have that kind of an impact.
Wow.
With this population. So that's kind of where my journey started. I ended up getting a master's in behavior analysis. I became a board certified behavior analyst. I joined a fellowship, which was interdisciplinary with a lot of different professionals that work in the neurodiversity space. From healthcare to social work, I was representing behavior. And over the years, I have worked in clinics, I have worked in school districts, I have worked with families in their homes, I have worked with organizations that want to be more neuro-inclusive, and I've helped a lot of neurodivergent job seekers as well. So in terms of supporting people with neurodiversity, my youngest client was 1.5 years. And my oldest is in their 40s. So it's a huge range of experiences that I sort of bring to the table. But somewhere along that journey, I actually discovered my own neurodivergence. And, we live in in a really modern place, and in the modern workplace, the demands are really high. And I found myself burning out. I found myself burning out pretty badly. And somewhere along that journey of getting support for that, I ended up in a therapist's office myself, learning that I had high functioning ADHD and I had sensory processing disorder. And being in the field already, I had no idea what I was going to do with that. And when I spoke to my workplace about my neurodivergence, I immediately noticed a shift in people's behaviors. Right? People were looking over my shoulder. And I should have known something was going on because every performance evaluation spoke to my interest in so many different projects and being on every committee and having great relationships. But if my employer had noticed that as a strength and really looked at my position to see where can Khushboo best serve our organization, because she is stellar at all of these things that are outside of her job description. And it's so funny that I now teach companies how to do that. So it's a full circle moment for me. As a coach, when I sit with neurodivergent job seekers, I get to sit across from them and empower them to really embrace who they are and to know who they are, to advocate for who they are. And that is really what makes the difference. So let's talk about neurodiversity, okay? A lot of people, when they hear words like this, especially when they've never come across neurodiversity, or they may not know enough about every single thing that encompasses neurodiversity, we can get really scared. And I think because of that fear, there's a lot of stigma. And because of that stigma, there's a lot of issues with us being inclusive of neurodivergent people. And that applies not just to the workplace, that also applies to our schools, right? And to our educational institutions. It also applies in our social situations. It also applies in our community settings, right? There are people that are neurodivergent that are in every sphere of our life, okay? Neurodiversity, simply said, is a variation in brain functioning and behavior functioning, okay?
Mm.
So when we look around this room, we see a lot of diversity, right? I see people who have blonde hair. I see people who have brown hair. I see people who have white hair, right? I see people who have short hair and long hair. We all look very different. If we talk about height, if we talk about our ability to swim, we will see a lot of differences in how we can all sort of fit into all of these different things that we're measuring. However, all of us have brains, okay? All of us have brains. That means all of us are neurodiverse. Every one of us has a brain that creates the diversity of this room, right?
Yes.
If we can see physical variations and the differences in all of the physical variations that people have, then how can we, realistically assume that our brains are not unique? The way we process information is not unique. The way we complete tasks is not unique, right? The way we communicate is not unique. All of these things are an outcome of having different brains, right? Social communication, cognition, executive functioning, stimming, right? Our sensory needs, we all have different ones. And essentially what neurodiversity is the differences in that brain and behavior functioning. So first and foremost, if you take away one thing from this entire talk, all I want you to remember is that neurodiversity is normal, okay? 1 in 4 of us are neurodivergent. That means neurodivergent people are already in your workplaces, right? They're already in the educational institutions. They are already in the community settings. And as I have disclosed, we're also here in this room, right? The world wouldn't be here if we didn't have neurodivergent people. So the first thing is neurodiversity is normal. It already exists in every workplace.
Khushboo, can I interrupt you just for a minute? Because what you said caused me to think of something. You said 1 in 4 are neurodiverse. And I think, I'm not sure that I'll own my own stuff. I mean, I understand ADHD, I understand dyslexia, I understand things that are a bit more that impact a person's abilities or, the way they think, they kind of show up more strongly. But when you say 1 in 4, it makes me start thinking that there must be a bunch of other invisible or people have learned, as you had, to compensate for it. What are there other topics, titles? I mean, give me a range of what's on here.
Absolutely.
1 in 4 is pretty, I mean, that's over 25%. That's 25% of our population.
Yeah. So neurodiversity includes dyslexia, autism, ADHD, bipolar disorder, and Tourette syndrome. There's difference between being born with neurodiversity and acquiring neurodiversity through a different disability. And additionally, we can all display neurodivergent traits depending on what's going on around us, right? If you are, for example, grieving a death of somebody, your ability to complete a task is going to be very different from someone who's not under that kind of mental duress. So we can all have neurodivergent traits. And we're all neurodiverse in the fact that there's this diversity of brains among us. But in terms of diagnostic criteria, there is a lot of gaps in this. First of all, many females are not diagnosed with neurodiverse conditions until much, much, much later in life. Because neurodiversity has this variability in terms of gender as well. So for example, boys with ADHD got diagnoses for having ADHD because they were known as hyper boys. When However, little girls with ADHD present very differently. They have a lot of helping behaviors. They might be very talkative. They might have a lot of social groups. They might be teacher's pet. But those behaviors never set off an alarm for us. So even socially, the way we look at neurodiversity is very different. A lot of people, after they get out of high school, there's barely any supports for neurodivergent people. Most neurodivergent people never disclose to their colleges that they are neurodivergent because of the stigma that it creates, or because generally there's a lack of supports and services in educational institutions. Even less people disclose their neurodivergence on a job application.
Khushboo, may I ask a question?
Sure.
I love this line of thinking, Denise. Thank you. I am a college professor in higher ed. And when these particular traits are disclosed to faculty, they are disclosed under the veil of privacy and under the FERPA restrictions. So while we as faculty might be privy to this, and I say the word might, we are not allowed to be able to make that privy unless the candidate presents that and decides to disclose that in the mainstream classroom, if you will, regardless in person, online, it doesn't matter. And so the challenge becomes is the perception is if I as the professor know, and my behavior might slightly adjust to make accommodations for whatever might be needed, the classroom will notice my difference, but they will not be given an explanation why. And I don't know if that helps the stigma or further adds distance because I'm not allowed to say.
Well, I would say, honestly, Dr. Cheryl, I think you're doing a really great job of being inclusive of your classroom. And I think that it's not necessarily going to increase the stigma, but the issue with accommodations, and even for college students, most neurodivergent people don't know themselves well enough beyond a diagnosis. That's where the issue starts. If you don't know who you are, then you don't know what you need. If you don't know what you need, you don't know how to ask for what you need. If you don't know how to ask for what you need, you can't be accommodated for your needs, right? So it's really tricky. But I think that if you are being inclusive to that person in that moment in your classroom, you might not be realizing this, Dr. Cheryl, but you're probably being inclusive of other people who haven't disclosed that they have a neurodivergence. And more importantly, you might also be helping someone who speaks a different language because you're communicating more clearly. Or you might be helping someone who's from a different country, right? The thing about being inclusive of neurodiversity, it can happen in really, really small ways. It can be with over communicating and being really clear with your communication. It can be giving really specific directions and explicit tasks for people to complete. But those things help everybody. So every time we train organizations on how to be more inclusive of neurodiversity, every now and then someone will raise their hand and say, but this isn't really specific to neurodiversity. And what we tell them is it's not. This is how we become inclusive of everyone, right?
Yeah, we have another Tim has been kind of waiting for a comment or a question.
Thank you for noticing that, Denise. Thank you for telling about the various different things that fall under the diagnostic umbrella. When I also used to work in higher education, and you yourself have used this term high functioning, and we also hear this a spectrum, which makes it seem like high functioning is up. Like if we didn't know, we wouldn't know that there was a diagnosis for you, or that you had that. So, and I think people tend to like, you hear high functioning and you don't really see that they're different in the way they move through the organization or the world. And people may dismiss that.
Yeah.
You know, like, oh, okay, so you have ADHD, who doesn't? Or, you know, I mean, something along those lines. What would you say that would be helpful to put that in context? I don't even know if that's a good question, but.
Yeah. So first of all, people are sort of straying away from the functioning labels, just because we like to say high support and low support, but regardless of that, it is very different person to person, right? When you meet one person who's a neurodivergent individual, that person is just one person. Their strengths are unique to them. Their challenges are unique to them. And every other person that you meet that's a neurodivergent person after that is going to be a completely different profile, right? But that being said, I think that if someone discloses to you, the very first thing you should say is, thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for trusting me with that. Thank you for being open enough to tell me that you're struggling in some ways. And whether or not you know what that is, I, as your educator or your manager or your team lead or your colleague, I want to know how I can help you. And most often than not, the person is going to respond by saying they don't know what they need, which is not helpful. But, and I've been in that situation myself, right? But if you now say, okay, can you tell me some of the things that are challenging for you? Usually they'll open up and they'll start sharing, well, sometimes when you give me this assignment, I'm not really sure how to start. I don't really know how to get from point A to point Z. I'm having issues when we are constantly getting interrupted by meetings, right? It could be any number of things. But if you are in the position to point out that person's strengths for them, you're going to be doing a huge service for that person, because you are aligning them to understand where they can shine. And a lot of people who are neurodivergent, if they have not been diagnosed or if they aren't sure of who they are fully, then that can lead to a direction of them really figuring out who they are. And when it comes to challenges, for example, and my manager does this with me, so I'll share, I'm actually really lucky to be a part of a very neuro-inclusive team. And my manager will point out, hey, Kush, it's been, a few times now that I've noticed you've been struggling with this. And usually when he points it out, I will open up and tell him, well, the reason why I'm struggling is because I'm having issues with this technology. Would you mind showing me how to use it? Or is it possible for us to do check-ins more frequently rather than when something is due, so that I know I'm on the right track, right? And we have a working relationship where we've figured these things out. But I don't think this is something that, just a manager who's supporting a neurodivergent person should use. Again, this is how all of us should be managing people, right? We should all be coaching the people we're supporting and really sort of helping them figure out the strategies that are going to get them to where they need to go, wherever that is. Go ahead.
We have another question from Michelle, and it's from the other side. Mm-hmm. So what if you kind of think there's something different about you, but you don't know that? How can they understand what is different about them? And are there resources that can help them navigate to an answer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a really amazing tool that I'm going to pop right here in the chat. This is called the Neurodiversity's Normal website. And on here, you can actually take some self-assessments to figure out how your brain works differently in these different areas of neurodivergence. And also, you'll be adding anonymous data that we're collecting to show that neurodiversity and neurodivergent traits are significant between people who are neurodivergent, as well as people who consider themselves neurotypical. And it's just a start, but it could be a great conversation. You could get your team to take something like this. You could talk about, oh, that's interesting that all of us on the team work in this way. Isn't that interesting? How is it so that we all think about this in the same way? And it could be a great guide to just learning a little bit more about who you are, how you work, how you process information, and how you communicate with yourself and your world. So,
I think it's interesting. Yeah, I think it's interesting because in many ways, the conversation is a bit skewed towards white collar workers. And as you know, right now, it seems like we're laying off a bunch of white collar workers, but we're struggling. Many industries, hospitality, retail, service industries in general are struggling with trying to find people. And in my work, I find that there's a broad level of neurodiverse people in that, and they've not been diagnosed because they're in the lower end, and it costs a lot of money to get your child diagnosed. I've got 2 kids that have issues or different ways of processing information, and now I found out that my 40-year-old nephew is probably, he doesn't know it and he won't admit it just yet, but he's probably autistic. And so there's been a lot of things that happen in that, but the hiring process, the way people think about bringing people in, the lack of structure in terms of jobs has been a big issue in helping them navigate and be part of the work, be productive members of the workforce. What do you suggest if this goes out to a lot of people, and I try to send it to particularly those folks in those industries that I know? What are 2 or 3 things that you would suggest that in those particular industries, which are high repetition, but very service oriented, what would you suggest that they could do to be able to help folks adapt to the work, assess whether the work is the right thing for them, or other things that you can think of in the work that you've done?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I was just getting to that. So, it's interesting because, when we look at employment rates of different neurodivergent people, we don't have a lot of data on a lot of different conditions, and it's due to probably, the monitoring practices across different countries, so on and so forth. However, we do know for a fact that when it comes to autism, which is highly researched, which is why there's most data on that, only 18% of autistic adults have employment in a community integrated setting. That's a very low percentage. Just, I think a month or 2 ago, CDC released the new rates of autism in the United States, which includes participants from other categories outside of white boys, which is what the data was based on before. And 1 in 36 children that are 8-year-olds right now in the United States are going to grow up to be adults with autism. And only 18% of them have employment right now. And I will say this, a lot of people think that, autistic brains are just made for jobs in the service industries or high repetition tasks. However, just in the last 3 years, I have placed an autistic person in a nursing role. I have placed an autistic person in an HR role. I have placed an autistic individual as a data analyst. I've placed an autistic person in a music technologist role, in an animator role, in a digital art role. Autistic people or people who are neurodivergent are everywhere. They have so many skills. They have so many abilities. However, the biggest barrier that people who are neurodivergent face in college is that they are not trying to work multiple part-time jobs and internships while they're surviving college education. So most of the people that I'm coaching have very limited experience. And if you look at any entry-level job posting on any job board, it has a years of experience requirement. Many neurodivergent people are very literal. So when they look at something, they take it for what it says, right? So when you see a bullet point that says excellent written and verbal communication, most of them are like, that's not me. That's not me, you know?
Yeah.
Or it says 1 to 3 years of experience. That's not me either, right? I have a bachelor's degree in computer science, but this job description says I need to know 6 more technologies. That's not me either, right? It's kind of like telling someone on a wheelchair to come into a building when there's stairs there and no ramp and saying, well, the door's open, get in here, right? And so I think there's a lot of barriers right off the bat, even just looking at a job description. Now we add ATS software and we talk about phone screens and a random recruiter repeatedly calling you at any random hour of the day, saying something super vague, such as, tell me about yourself. And this person who might have anxiety, who might communicate differently, who needs more specific questions in order to truly express themselves, is going to be completely lost. Most of my clients struggle at the very first step of the phone screen. Now, we're not even just talking about the interview, right? Any interview that someone walks into and they have very limited work experience, now you're asking them a situational question in the interview. They've never experienced that situation before. What are we doing, right? So there's so many different things. And now let's imagine that you're in the workplace and there's something that everybody else seems to know within the work culture. It's like around the water cooler, everybody knows this thing about our workplace, but nobody has ever translated that for the neurodivergent person, right?
Yeah.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just about bringing diverse people in. What are we doing to create a culture where people don't feel excluded, right? It's about, are you going to be the manager who spends an extra hour helping the neurodivergent person who doesn't have a Rain Man brain? That's where the equity and inclusion comes in. Are you going to be the person who brings that person into the social circles when there's an event going on and they're just standing there on the side looking lost and confused? That's where the equity and inclusion comes in, right? And a lot of neurodivergent people don't know the rules. So they end up just kind of being there and not really understanding how to interact in meetings, for example. So a lot of my students, one of my job seekers who is working just got written up for not speaking up enough during meetings. There's a very simple fix to that. As a manager, you can say, hey, we haven't heard from you in a while. Why don't you share something, right? It means that as a recruiter, if someone is nervous on the phone, instead of just like going through your list of questions, just tell that person they're doing great. It's okay. You know, we're having a conversation. It means that when you're having an interview with someone, you're allowing them to talk about how they work rather than things that they've never done, or talk about a company that they've never worked at to speak about how much they want to work there. Do you know what I'm saying? I think we're doing a lot of things in like this backwards way, because when we decided that someone should walk into a room full of strangers and bare their soul and talk about how much they love that company, that's not an interview. That's just something else, right? If you, for example, brought someone who was neurodivergent to an interview and asked them to do a project and speak about that project, they would be able to tell you their process. They would be able to explain their thinking. They would be able to tell you what they tried. They would tell you what they failed and how they came to a conclusion. And that's how they work, right? So,
it's interesting when you, so a couple things that came up in the chat, but also in my brain here. One is going back to the diagnosis piece in there. It costs a lot. And for most people, particularly the numbers that are coming up now, as I've also seen where women just didn't get diagnosed with ADHD, period. And so they don't even know. They just think they're supposed to do 50 things at one time.
Mm-hmm.
Where, if I don't know this and I don't figure this out, and there's not a lot of research in this area, how would I navigate all of this? Are there, like, I noticed on your background, you have the Goodwill program of Silicon Valley. Do all the Goodwills across the nation have similar programs? Do they go to the state vocational programs? Are there things that we can do that navigate that? And then my second question comes from a series that talks about much of what you're talking about from the employment side. It's not just good employment practices in general, but it also is about emotional intelligence and the manager having enough emotional intelligence to not get focused on this person is neurodivergent, but how do I treat them as a human being and understand that I can't read their minds, they can't read my minds. Therefore, we already have a communication barrier, regardless of who the person is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing that we like to talk a lot about at Neurodiversity Pathways is this concept of compassionate curiosity, right? This is habit 5 of 7 habits of highly effective people, which we do teach our students. Seek first to understand before trying to be understood, right? Be curious. So when you see something that doesn't make sense, all you have to do as someone who knows a neurodivergent person is say, hey, I noticed before we did that meeting, you were pacing around a lot. Like, is this something that makes you really nervous? Like, can you talk to me a little bit about it? So I just know how to help you in those moments, right? And going back to the diagnosis question, yes, it is extremely expensive and tedious to get a diagnosis. I was lucky that I had a therapist who just happened to notice that everything I was depressed about was related to executive functioning and ADHD. That's all it was. She had a thought. She decided that she was going to test me, and it happened. But not a lot of people are that lucky. Many people end up masking for decades, if not years. I meet a lot of people who are parents of neurodivergent children who decide to get tested and diagnose themselves. I have people who have struggled their whole life with, intimate relationships or keeping friendships, who suddenly start asking, what's wrong? Something is not working out. And, this goes back to kind of understanding the medical model of disability versus the social model of disability, right? The medical model talks about disability as there being a problem because of that disability. The social model of disability is not looking at differences as deficits and syndromes and disorders. What the social model does is it looks at disability as this person is disabled because of the world around them. The world is not accommodating enough of them to support them. And that is the social model of disability. When we talk about accommodations, which I don't like to use that word because it's like it's already a power dynamic when you're offering an accommodation to somebody and somebody having to ask for an accommodation. But I wanted to have a conversation today because the biggest accommodation that you can provide to a neurodivergent person is a mindset of compassionate curiosity. It's to include them for their abilities and accept them for their differences, no matter who they are. Because I genuinely believe that every individual, regardless of their abilities, regardless of their differences, can be included and should be included in every social setting, in every community setting, every education setting, and every workplace setting. We all have a purpose on this universe. But if we are creating so many barriers for people to have the ability to work, we're doing a disservice to this completely untapped talent pool. And
Yes.
they bring so much to the table.
Yeah,
You know?
I agree. Couple comments, and then Susan has a question on it. Lots of pats and stars and happy faces. Daniel Goldman's work. Dr. Cheryl mentioned something in the chat about this sounds more and more like a leadership problem and teaching people how to be good leaders more so than it is a neurodivergence problem out of it. And I think that's really good. Everybody, if you're looking for a hashtag, so go Leadership Global, hashtag Leadership Global, hashtag compassionate curiosity after this particular meeting. And I think the last thing that is there is the distinction. They love the distinction you made between the medical model and the social model. And helping people understand that there's two different things. And so there's just a different way of doing of thinking about this rather than feeling like I'm incapable of asking these questions. If it's from a social model, it levels the playing field a little bit more in terms of me being able to inquire and to be curious about that. So those were some of the comments that were coming up. Susan, you had a question or a comment?
A comment. I really love the fact that you were talking about honoring the uniqueness of every individual, that you were looking at them not as a person with a problem, but a person that is a unique individual, and they bring special things to whatever they are doing because of the way they process and use their brain. And I am 70 years old, so nobody ever talked in terms of neurodiversity as I was growing up. And I will tell you, the phrase my mother used for me was, you are shy, smart, tall, and quiet. People will mistake that for being stuck up. You are going to have to reach out to them. In a sense, she was pointing out that I probably was neurodiverse. She didn't have a way to frame it as such. I am obviously dyslexic, but nobody ever even called me that until I was in my 40s. I just was a bad speller. You know, I could do the math and science, but I couldn't spell. You find that there are many of us who probably in life would never ever come across this word to even know that we had something to talk about with others. Absolutely. And as there were diagnoses for other people later in life, those of us who can look at them and go, yeah, maybe I do have something along those lines. Never once did I ever think of myself as anything other than normal. I was just me. And in some ways, I think that was an incredible blessing that my parents gave me, to always just look at what could I do with what skills and gifts I had. And that's probably the best way we can talk about how do we take that as leaders into the workplace, to look at who we have on our teams that we could help become the best they have without a diagnosis.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We have one other, I'm not going to name the person, but they talked about that they were diagnosed at 38 and had autism, and that it was through a group of friends and a network, and how expensive it is. But the comment that I wanted to bring up was they do not feel comfortable disclosing that they're autistic or have, or I think that's probably for everybody, because immediately I think people's reaction, and you alluded to this earlier, is to back up and to see you as something wrong, or to distance themselves emotionally from you. And people don't want that. They, because then again, we can't read people's brains. And so what starts twirling around in that person's brain is, particularly managers, I don't want to be a lawsuit. I don't want to say the wrong thing. Oh my God, you're not the right person. How could I have missed this? And so they, we naturally go into our own defense mechanisms, or self-talk, I'll say defense self-talk, to justify where we're at, but then get cautious with dealing with the person. And that just does not add to the relationship. Given that there's probably a number of people who are going to hear this, who might see themselves as neurodiverse and are sitting on the fence on whether they should or should not disclose, what do you suggest in terms of if I don't want to go full blown or step out and say I'm autistic or I'm ADHD for whatever reason? How can they create a relationship with their supervisor and colleagues, because they need their help with their colleagues, such that they can at least get a safe space to be able to be in the workplace?
That's a tricky question, and it's a very, very, very personal decision. So one of the things at Neurodiversity Pathways is not only do we work with neurodivergent job seekers who are unemployed and who are coming from the Department of Rehabilitation and regional centers, but we also work with companies in order to help support them on how to support neurodivergent people. The biggest thing is, when a neurodivergent person hasn't already accepted that identity as their own, then it is so incredibly difficult to discern when it is safe to disclose that identity to their manager, right? If you have a manager or a supervisor or a team lead or anyone who's leading who is already sort of pointing out the things that you are challenged by, that person is not going to feel psychologically safe to now disclose later on once there's already a performance issue in question. That being said, if a person does not want to disclose, but does want to make their needs known, we teach our students to be able to advocate in very simple ways. I work best when blank. I prefer to receive feedback in blank ways. Is it possible for us to have a meeting only once a week, right? But again, for you to even ask for these things or bring them up with your team, there needs to be a level of psychological safety within that culture, right? When we talk about culture, what we're saying is, what are the conditions required for someone to thrive, right? So if we're talking about neurodiversity, usually what that person really needs for them to be an open member of the team, and they wouldn't be disclosing to the whole team, they would only be disclosing to their manager, by law, does not need to let the team know of anything unless there's a situation in which a colleague is going to be working closely and they might need to know certain things. So there's also rules and laws behind all of that disclosure stuff. But just being able to say, this is how I work best. This is what I need for me to present my best work. This is the kind of feedback that would be most helpful to me, right? I would like to have a little bit more time with my project, right? All of us are so socialized to not ask for help that if you are in a culture where that's a norm, then that person may or may not ever disclose. They might just continue masking. And a lot of companies will state, as a disclaimer on their job postings, that they're open to hiring any people with disabilities as well. But a lot of people never take an affirmative action stance, which many organizations can when it comes to disability. And if they do, that would be them, really being open to people who have differing experiences. It would be about accepting people who are self-taught. It would be about taking people in that work very differently than your other team members.
Right.
But it's not about saying that everything should be changed to accommodate this one person. It's about saying, how can we look at how we do things so that it makes it easier for everybody?
Excellent. We have one question and we're coming up on the top of the hour.
Sounds good.
So, we're in a hybrid situation now, and so many people are, working differently than being face to face. What do you think, the question is what do you think about when we ask people to turn on their cameras so that we can see eyeballs to eyeballs of individuals? Is that something is it good, bad, or does it cause issues, etc.?
It can be different for different people. This is definitely a personal thing. So if you have a team, I would suggest, coming up with norms and expectations as a team, just so that everyone's opinions are heard. One of my team members, John, he will come on camera, but he won't make eye contact. And he's literally told us, if you see me doodling, I'm listening. If you see me looking at you, I'm confused. Okay. That's a really simple way for him to accommodate his need of not having to make eye contact 24/7.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit weird to make too much eye contact. As a clinician, I had to teach my students about eye contact, and it wasn't about make eye contact so you're normalized. It was about, make eye contact so you can read social cues. Like, what is an appropriate level of eye contact? If someone stares at you maybe like 3 to 5 seconds longer than they should, we all get scared, right? So let's talk about, why are we even requiring something like that? Because what does eye contact have to do with work? That's the bigger question. If you want to hear my opinions in the team meeting, then why does my camera need to be on? Right? So it's a personal question. I would say people need to just kind of think about it person to person and just kind of understand their team members better so that you can accommodate all of them in the right way.
Right. This has been such a great conversation, and the chat is lit up with people asking questions, making comments, thumbs up, hearts, the whole thing. And I know people have to go because it is getting to that hour. I will say one thing that I started doing a while back now is Microsoft PowerPoint has closed caption, and it actually, it's funny because I was doing the training and it picks up the sound in the room. So people in the back of the room who ask questions now see their questions across the top. And at the break, so many people came up to me and said, I'm so glad you did that because I can't hear, I didn't understand, the language and the accents were different, and I can't hear in the back the noise of this, that, and the other. And just something as simple as use the technology that's already in front of you, such as Microsoft, which has built-in accessibility that you can use during all your training. I do train on video, the whole thing. I turn closed caption on for everybody, knowing that their attention span just goes different places and they can copy the chat and go back over stuff like that. But at any rate, I cannot, if I were with you, just know that I'm giving you a ghost hug. Powerful. The works. How can people get a hold of you? Just say it on the screen so that those who are not part of this can at least hear how they can connect with you.
Absolutely. I'm going to pop my LinkedIn here in the chat. I believe that I'm also probably linked somewhere on all the socials for Leadership Global for this event. Our organization does support neurodivergent job seekers. So if you know anyone who's struggling with employment, who has been struggling with employment for a while, we have a career launch program that supports them through a 17-week training followed by 6 months of one-on-one coaching, which is all covered by California's Department of Rehabilitation. Also, we do provide neurodiversity in the workplace awareness sessions that are 90 minutes, super interactive session. We also do in-depth workshops on how to support neurodivergent talent in your office as well.
Thank you.
Please reach out. And I just want to say thank you for your understanding. I know I talk a lot. This is my ADHD in action. I appreciate you being patient with me this session. And thank you so much for giving me the stage to talk about this.